Dave Talks Comics, Episode 117, Superman Adventures, Part 2. Welcome to Dave Talks Comics, the program where I talk about comic books, cartoons, and comic book conventions. Most episodes are a mix of summary and opinion and include spoilers. Please keep that in mind. Spoilers. All past episodes can be streamed or downloaded from the program's website, davetalkscomics.com. In addition to the program's website, this podcast can also be found on iTunes, Stitcher, and Facebook. This episode continues my coverage of Superman Adventures. I will be talking about a two-part story from the comic book series which was inspired by Superman the Animated Series. It is from Superman Adventures 7 and 8. I talked about a few other issues of Superman Adventures in episode 98, which can be found on the show's website, davetalkscomics.com, by clicking on the episode guide link at the top of the page and then scrolling down to the Superman section and clicking on the Superman Adventures Part 1 link, or by Googling Dave Talks Comics 98. Superman Adventures issues 7 and 8 is another two-parter. This one is called All Creatures Great and Small. These issues are cover dated May and June of 1997. The writer is Scott McCloud, the penciler is Rick Burchett, the inker is Terry Austin, and the colors are by Marie Severin. And one cute thing about the credits in these issues is, well, as the title implies, this has to do with shrinking and enlarging. So the credits are Scott McCloud is credited as Big Words, Rick Burchett, Petite Pencils, Terry Austin, Immense Inks, Lois Buhalis, Little Letters, Marie Severin, Colossal Colors, and Mike Aveney, Half Pint. I think he must be the editor. Anyhow, this has a really neat cover to it. You see Superman fighting two of his fellow Kryptonians, Mala and Jack Sur, on a desk in front. So all three of them are shrunk down. They're smaller than normal size. And Superman's punch has just punched Jack Sur, and Mala is jumping down onto Superman. She's about to land on him using with a pencil as, I guess, a spear. And it's kind of a nice arrangement. And they do a good job with the background. And there's all this script up on the, I guess, Superman's feet must have hit a lot of the keys, and it's just kind of gobbledygook, except for somewhere in the middle there it says "Kapow." So, and the title on the cover reads "Tiny Problems." So the first page is really neat. It's a 9-panel grid which shows Jack Sur and Mala, who are these two villains. They were criminals who had been in the Phantom Zone and who Superman has pulled out of the Phantom Zone. And all you see is the two of them. And so it's not, I mean, the cover kind of gives something away, but you can't see what size they are really based on this 9-panel grid. But it's basically, I think Mala only says one thing, but it's basically Jack Sur going nuts, claiming that they don't have any right to keep them there, and what he's going to do once he gets free. And it's just beautifully done. And, he's turning back and forth and pointing his finger several times and gritting his teeth and yelling. And I just really love that page. The next page is a splash page. Page 2 is a splash page where you see that Mala and Jack Sur are in this little box and that they've been shrunk down to, I don't know, maybe just 3 inches tall or something like that. Maybe less than that. And Superman and Lois Lane and Professor Hamilton are looking down at them. I think they're in a prison at this point, because at some point Professor Hamilton said something about going back to Star Labs, so they must not be there. And it does look like the place where they're left later on. So anyway, this issue, part 1 of All Creatures Great and Small, can be broken into basically 4 scenes. The first one is the one that I've started to describe here, where we see Superman, Lois Lane, Professor Hamilton, Jack Sir, Mala, also Dan Turpin and Maggie Sawyer are in this scene. And basically it's basically exposition as to what happened. I haven't read the issues immediately prior to this one, issues 4, 5, and 6. Yes, issues 4, 5, and 6, but I don't believe this story picks up from something that happened in issue 6 or even one of the previous issues. Because I'm pretty sure this is the first appearance of Jack Sir and Mala in the Superman Adventures comic. So it's a lot of exposition here, explaining how they got here, about the Phantom Zone. I guess basically for the benefit of people who may not be as familiar with them. And Superman explains that the Phantom Zone is cruel and unusual punishment. Let me see if I can find the exact words he uses here. He says something, here we go. That's true, Lois, but they've been left to our laws now, and believe me, the Phantom Zone is the very definition of cruel and unusual punishment. So he feels that they have to take them out of the Phantom Zone. I guess they are supposed to be the only Phantom Zone prisoners, I guess. Although I'm pretty sure there was more than that in the original Superman comic book, Superman and Action Comics. I think there was other criminals who came out of the Phantom Zone from time to time. So this is basically, like I said, just exposition. So anyway, so a few weeks pass, and then we see Superman on a mission, trying to capture some members, I think, of Intergang, and he takes them to prison because, of course, there's no due process in the world of Superman Adventures. You just take the criminals to prison because, obviously, they're criminals. And while he's there, he finds out that there's been a break-in in the prison, and that during this, Superman or Jack Sir and Mala have escaped. Now, they were placed in a cell where they would not be exposed to sunlight, because the idea was that if they were exposed to sunlight, they would gain superpowers, and by keeping them out of sunlight, they would not be strong enough to break out of the cell that they were in. So they escape, but they haven't left the building yet, and they wind up getting into a fight with Superman and Dan Turpin, and there are some. Let's see. Oh, and then in the process of this fight, Superman gets hit with the shrinking ray, and is shrunk down to the same size that Jack Sir and Mala are. And they manage to take him out, and just as they're flying off, Dan Turpin, they punch Dan Turpin, and he falls down on top of him. And I thought that was a really cool panel where you see Superman looking up, you just see one eye, him looking up, and him seeing this shadow falling down on him, and the next panel you see Dan Turpin falling, but you can't see Superman because he's been crushed by Dan Turpin. He isn't crushed, but he's, smothered under Dan Turpin's backside. And Superman even makes some sarcastic comment about he might want to start counting calories. So that's scene 2. Scene 3 is Superman turns to Lois for help. So he flies to the Daily Planet, and this scene doesn't last very long, but basically he's already contacted Professor Hamilton and told Professor Hamilton to meet him and Lois at Lois's apartment that evening. So Professor Hamilton is going to bring the device, which isn't just a shrinking ray, but it can also enlarge things. So at the end of the day, they go back to Lois's apartment, and we get some. There's one funny scene here that I really liked, where Lois is sorry about the mess. I don't know where all this junk comes from, and she's trying to pick things up, and things are flying everywhere. Like junk mail, and there's plates and glasses everywhere, and Superman isn't really fazed by it, but Lois is apparently kind of embarrassed. She has this sheepish grin on her face. So Professor Hamilton shows up, and unfortunately, almost immediately, Mala and Jack Sir also show up, and a fight breaks out between Superman and Jack Sir and Mala, and it's a neat kind of fight. And actually, Lois gets into the fight too. At one point, she smashes Jack Sir with a book, but of course, Jack Sir is Kryptonian and has super strength, so that it hurts him a little, but it doesn't cause any permanent sort of damage to him. And then at another point, she uses bug spray on Mala, which I thought was pretty funny. And let me see, I think there's some pretty good scenes with the fight between Mala and Superman, where she takes a pen, kind of like on the cover where she's using a pencil. She takes a pen and crushes it on his chest, but of course that doesn't injure him. But during this fight, they've forgotten about the shrinking ray, and apparently Jack Sir has got his hands on it, and he's reversed it, and not only is he back to normal size, he's giant size now. So he's like, I don't know, a few 100 feet tall or something like that. And that's basically where this issue ends. Let's see if there's anything. I think I basically covered everything that I wanted to say about this issue. I wasn't as crazy about this issue. It really works. The whole story works as a whole. But after I read this one, I was kind of lukewarm. The second one really cemented it for me. So once again, we got a really cool cover with issue 8. In this case, we see Superman unconscious, and Jack Sir is holding him up like he's about to swallow him, like he's got his mouth open wide, and he's getting ready to eat Superman. And I think it was Tiny Problems. Wait, what was the title on the? Tiny Problems was the title on the cover of issue 7. On issue 8, it's A Big Problem. So, possibly my favorite panel, my favorite splash page in this story is the first page of issue 2, where we see people running from presumably Jack Sir. And it's interesting because you see there's two sorts of reactions. There's people who are running, and there's people who are stopping to stare and look up, and some of them are pointing. And there's just something about it that I really find. And the way there's cars on the street, it's in the middle of the street, so you've got cars stopped there. There's a policeman in the middle of everything. You've also got the credits, which once again, massive Scott McCloud, Behemoth Rick Burchett, Towering Terry Austin, supersized Marie Severin, big Lois Bohalis, and little Mike Avney as the editor. So this is a really cool panel. And part of it, I think, is the coloring, too, the variety of colors that Marie Severin used on this. So basically, this picks up immediately where the previous issue left off. Jack Sir is wrecking havoc. He's now, I don't know, a few 100 feet tall, I would guess. He's bigger than the building that Lois lives in, which is a high-rise, I believe. So he's probably a few 100 feet tall. And you would get this great recap on page 2 where she says, "Okay, Superman, let me get this straight. One of the galaxy's most dangerous psychopaths just grew as tall as a mountain, ripped the roof off of my apartment building, and is standing there laughing, and you're still just 2 inches high?" And Superman says, "That's about the size of it." So I thought it was a great use of you could on the one hand find that a little annoying, but I think it's comical as well as informative. You know, it's exposition, but it's not to be. It's because after all, who knows? You know, especially back in the 90s, before we had digital comics, not all issues were more available than they had been prior to, like, maybe 20 years before, 15 years before. But it's still, at the same time, I'm sure there were people who only found this issue and didn't find the previous issue. So in this first scene, once again, we have Jack Sir on the rampage. He's smashing buildings. He's doing what he can to cause havoc. And Superman goes to Professor Hamilton, who still has the ray, and asks him if he can make him big again. Or is that what he says? Yeah, yes, Professor Hamilton. Is the machine intact? Superman, I can barely hear your voice over this din. Let me see if the machine is still intact, and it's still working. He says, I can restore you to your normal size. And at that point, we get this great panel where Mala attacks Superman. Now, Mala is still shrunk down. Jack Sir is giant, but Mala is still 2 inches tall, like Superman is. And then this great panel at the bottom of page 4 where Mala is charging Superman, which I really love. So we get a fight there between Mala and Superman, and Professor Hamilton tries to turn the ray on Superman and ends up turning it on Mala instead. So Mala is back to regular size. So, I don't know, 6 feet tall or whatever size she's supposed to be. So, and then at that point, Jack Sir steps in and grabs the machine, the device, and swallows it, tosses it down his throat and swallows it. And he basically apologizes to Mala. He says, sorry, there can only be one. Actually, he doesn't even say sorry. He says, there can be only one such as I. And she's like, yes, General. But she follows him. And they take off, continuing to cause damage. And actually Lois gets knocked off this building, but Superman saves her. And interesting, we actually get a shot of, you don't see it in full, but you get just a merest hint of Lois's underwear underneath her miniskirt, because she's always wearing a miniskirt. Well, a skirt, yeah, I think it's usually a miniskirt, as short as they are. And let's see. So Jack Sir's on the rampage once again. He has left Superman and Lois and Professor Hamilton behind. He has swallowed the device, which would have allowed Superman to return to normal size, and possibly their last hope to get Jack Sir back shrunk down. And on page 11 of this issue, we get this great splash page where you see Jack Sir walking through Metropolis. People of Earth, your domination over this world has passed. Meet your new masters. He's very triumphant, I guess would be the way to put it. And so that's like in the upper left corner. And in the bottom right corner, you see Lois on the phone talking to the Daily Planet, talking to Perry White, her boss. And it's just I love the angle of the shot from her going all the way back up to him. And then in between the two, you can see all these people running in panic. And so the first part of this story is basically things getting worse. Jack Sir swallowing the device, and then okay. So in the second scene of this issue, of this half of the story, Dan Turpin shows up. And he's got hand grenades, he's got an assault rifle, and he decides to take on Jack Sir and Mala because, he's Dan Turpin. And he doesn't get very far. I mean, he fires them up with his assault rifle, he throws some hand grenades at them, but he ends up just annoying Jack Sir. And there's this great panel at the top of page 14 where Jack Sir slaps Dan Turpin. You see Dan Turpin going flying backwards, and all you can see of Jack Sir is his hand. But so it's a really cool panel. And so basically, Dan Turpin winds up in the hospital because of this. But Superman goes to visit him in the hospital, and Superman gets an idea from talking to Dan Turpin. And so then Superman goes after. Superman decides to take another shot at Jack Sir. And actually, I guess we hadn't really seen Superman fight Jack Sir since he had become a giant. But Superman has donned this special suit. I don't think they don't give a name to the suit, but it's maybe the same kind of suit that he used in some of the stories where he flew out into space, possibly. But On page 18, you get this great 6-panel grid where you see Superman flying, and it's all done from behind Superman. You see him getting closer and closer to Jack Sir, and then the final panel is, well, the last 2 panels you see Jack Sir's mouth. At first Jack Sir has his back to him in the earlier panels, and then Jack Sir starts to turn, and then in the last couple panels Jack Sir is facing Superman. You see Superman flying closer to Jack Sir's mouth, and he flies into Jack Sir's mouth. And basically he retrieves, what he's doing is he's going down into Jack Sir to retrieve the device so he can return everybody to their normal sizes. Or certainly return himself to his normal size. And over the next few pages, next couple pages, pages 19 and 20, I love the facial expressions on Jack Sir as he tries to, because Mala's like, wait, you just swallowed him, don't, keep your mouth closed, don't let him out, And Jack Sir is trying to, and Superman basically makes Jack Sir cough. By, I think, tickling the inside of his mouth. And you can see Jack Sir trying to avoid coughing, and it's really great. I mean, they've done a really good job with the visual storytelling and with giving you the information you need, not just through the words, but also through the pictures. So basically, Superman gets the device. He gets out of Jack Sir's mouth. He uses the device. Jack Sir and Mala get shrunk back down to 2 inches high. And Superman's returned to his normal size. And that's basically the end of this issue, of this story. And actually Dan Turpin gets the last word. But this is a really good story. I'm really glad that I read it. I decided to read this. I bought this through Comixology. These issues are 99 cents a piece on Comixology. I decided to read this based on some of the letter columns in, I think, issue 11 or 12, which talked about this story and made it sound really cool. And I've always enjoyed the stories where Superman deals with other survivors of Krypton, usually who are not friendly, it seems. Although I suppose most of the people from the bottled city of Kandor are not evil. But I really... I always had a soft spot in my heart. I know some people aren't as crazy about those stories. They think it's ridiculous because Superman's supposed to be the only survivor of Krypton, and yet you have, at least in the Silver Age and the Bronze Age, you had all these other survivors of Krypton who seemed to come out of the woodwork over the years between 1939 and, I guess, Crisis on Infinite Earths, when they did away with just about everybody. Yeah, I think everybody, all the others. So that's it for Superman Adventures issues 7 and 8, All Creatures Great and Small. If you're a fan of Superman, I think you'd probably enjoy this, or a fan of Superman the Animated Series. I think you might enjoy this. The art is great, the story is great. It's got both humorous, it definitely has some humorous touches in it that I really appreciated. I like the action, the fight choreography is great. It's just overall, I think it's a really good story, and I think it's worth checking out. I want to talk a little bit about, I have some notes on Mala and Jack Sir, the two villains here. Of course, Superman Adventures is based on the Superman the Animated Series, and Mala, both of these characters had appeared in the animated series 3 times. There was a 2-parter called Blasts from the Past, which was the first story from season 2, so episodes 1 and 2 of season 2, and then they showed up again in season 3 in a story called Absolute Power. Mala is basically a DC Animated Universe creation. She's based on 2 other characters. Feora, who was a Phantom Zone criminal from the comic books, and Ursa, who was the female from Superman 2, the movie. And it's interesting to note that Mala on the cartoon, the second time around in the story called Absolute Power, she was voiced by the same actress who played Ursa in Superman 2. I'm not sure who played her in the other episode, the other story. Now, Jack Sir originally came from the comic books, although he looks different. In the comic books, he's bald and a bit stocky, but in the animated universe and in the animated universe and in the Superman Adventures comic book, he has a full head of hair and he wears an eye patch, and he's solid, but he's not stocky like I'd describe him. At least the pictures I saw of him online. And I should also mention that both of them also appear in Superman Adventures number 21, which is also the first appearance of Supergirl in the Superman Adventures series. Now, as I said, Jack Sir first appeared in Superman. It first appeared in the comic books. He goes all the way back to the Silver Age. His first appearance was in Adventure Comics number 289, which is cover dated October of 1961. His origin is that he was a scientist who was imprisoned in the Phantom Zone after one of his experiments resulted in the destruction of one of Krypton's moons, which was inhabited by colonists from Krypton. And I think there may have been some connection between he and Jor-El, Superman's father, but I didn't do an extreme amount of research on this. He appeared regularly, like a few times a year he would show up in a story. It's possible that some of these appearances, I'm basing this on what I found on Comic Book DB, it's possible that some of these appearances were cameos, but he basically appeared on a fairly regular basis from 1961 to 1968. From 69 to 76, not so much. There was a few appearances, but it wasn't like every year he was making appearances. From 77 to 86, which basically takes you up to Crisis on Infinite Earths, he once again started to make more regular appearances. And his last appearance was in DC Comics Presents number 97, which is a Phantom Zone story, which of course involves Superman. And it's also the last issue of DC Comics Presents. And it's one of those it's not the final Superman, pre-Crisis on Infinite Earths Superman story, but it is but it's the last issue of DC Comics Presents. It's one of those stories that's kind of wrapping things up because it's the last appearance of the Phantom Zone, I believe, for quite a while. In addition to the Dave Talks Comics website, davetalkscomics.com, this podcast can also be found on iTunes, Stitcher, and Facebook. If you have comments or questions, I can be reached at davetalkscomics@gmail.com, on Twitter @DaveTalksComics, or leave a comment on my website. I'm Dave. Thank you for listening.